Gemini Wing is one of those classic 1980s vertical scrolling shooters which is as sharp today to play as it was back in 1987. This cute shoot 'em up was released for arcades back in 1987 by Tecmo. Tecmo produced some of the best arcade games, including Riger, which released a year prior to this game. Of course, the 80s and even 90s was full of scrolling shooters, so what made this game, Gemini Wing, so different? Well, if you are a fan of the genre like myself, most shooters of the decades were space orientated, either with black backgrounds with twinkling stars or at least backgrounds which represented dystopian futures. Absolutely nothing wrong with this style, but what happens if you fancy the cute 'em up? Again, in 1986, Sega's awesome arcade game Fantasy Zone released and to some extent gave the genre a standard or framework at least to work from. How could blowing things up and shooting things be so cute and bubbly? A bizarre concept at the time, but this works very well nevertheless. You either like cute 'em ups or you find them patronising. I think it's a Marmite subgenre of the shoot 'em up category. I personally like this style as much as regular space shooters. Of course, since the release of Gemini Wing, cute 'em up games have been in plenty, but back in 1987, the world was still relatively new to experience this style of game. The game isn't as difficult as some shoot 'em ups of the 80s, but still gives a challenge at certain points. We control a futuristic gunship in which we need to shoot down insectoids in order to save the world from them taking over completely. We shoot them down using a pea shooter, and so precise accuracy is needed to shoot down enemies here. We also have various gunballs we can collect, which gives the player various upgrades, such as one-time only attacks or even speed-ups. We can normally get gunballs when enemies are flying around with them. We are met with boss fights at the end of stages, which of course goes without saying, this is a shooter after all. Virgin Masteronic released every port in 1989. There was also another version released for Japan, which I will cover in this video. So by popular request, today we are ranking every home conversion of the classic 1987 Tecmo release of Gemini Wing and determine which platform had the best thing next to the original arcade game itself. I have covered MSX many times in this series, and it's generally the case, especially MSX games produced in Britain, that users would get direct ports from the ZX Spectrum most of the time. These ports were very bad too. This is Gemini Wing for the MSX. This is likely the above and beyond lazy conversion. Never before in an MSX game have I ever seen options for Sinclair and even Kempston controller sources, but here you are. The real terrible thing here is that somebody even had the audacity to put conversion at the start menu. As you can be assured, this game looks like a ZX Spectrum game, and yes, it runs incredibly slow with no music. I am actually wondering if the developers behind this were even aware that they left Kempston and Sinclair on the controller selection screen, or did they realise this and just didn't care? Really though, some of these European MSX releases were utter shockers compared to the releases coming out of Japan at the time. Quite possibly one of the slowest Amstrad CPC shoot 'em ups I've ever played. We have to admit, the game looks really nice here for an 8-bit computer using its Mode 0 colours, but that is where it stops. It scrolls so slowly that it's fairly unplayable. It's insane how many deaths I suffered in this version. Although the colours used here are really nice, at times it is hard to make out enemy projectiles, as sometimes these are the same colour as the enemies themselves. The extreme slow frame rates here make this game so difficult, as controlling the gunship is also sluggish, and it seems some projectiles travel fairly fast compared with everything else, and avoiding them with this slow speed can be a nightmare. We have no music here, but we do have rudimentary sound effects, Amstrad CPC style that is. It is presented in that vertical centralised look, even though we have a couple of side borders on the left and right which was added to this release. The game slows down even more when too much is happening on screen. screen in any one time. I'll say it before and I'll say it again, all it took was to cut back on a few things and it's likely this would have ran much smoother than it actually did. The only part of this game which seemed to run fast was the waterfall part of the first stage where nothing was happening on screen. Now, by no means is Gemini Wing for the ZX Spectrum a good version, but it is playable and moves at a much better speed than the Amstrad's version in terms of vertical scrolling. This version actually feels like you were playing a game that is enjoyable to some extent, unlike that terrible so-called MSX conversion. A couple of issues with this release though are issues which makes this game very tough to play. Obviously this is a monochrome game and predominantly for the first stage at least we have a mustard yellow and black combination. The issue is where we fly into the valleys, the eyeballs which are mounted into the scenery are very hard to see as the outlines of them are black. The issue is that the scenery is of the same colour too. Now thankfully projectiles are red and very visible too. Anybody who played this conversion back in the day would have likely thought of particular enemies were an absolute nightmare. These are the enemies who fly extremely quickly, sometimes a few at a time even. Appearing from the top of the gameplay screen, they will speed down towards you. And as the scrolling does have a slight lag, this can be a nightmare of a situation to handle. We have no music, although the introduction screen does have a fairly nice tune. We can collect gun balls and by holding the fire button down for a couple of seconds releases them. Like I say, it's a step in the right direction for a decent home version of Gemini Wing, but certainly not the best. Likely one of the hardest versions of this game too. I will note though that the presentation of the ratio looks nice with its centralised vertical look. Likely the Commodore 64's conversion was the best out of all the 8-bit computer versions. On first glance and the first few seconds everything appears fine, but it's not perfect by any means. Of course we have that superior SID chip handling the music here, which sounds frankly phenomenal, although we get no sound effects with the music playing. Hit collision detection is very good and the colours themselves, although typical Commodore 64 style, which are a little dull compared to Amstrad's Mode 0 colours, we still have colours. So what's wrong with this version? Well, firstly we have a complete full screen here, and so that arcade look isn't really here at all. Secondly, as you play through the game you'll notice intense lag to the point where the music itself sounds like it's about to conk out. Controls are fairly good here and it is responsive, and no doubt about it, this version scrolls 90 times better than the previous versions of Gemini Wing covered so far. Of course, the stages, just like most other home conversions of this game, are shorter, but we do get a password system here, which is a nice little feature, which a couple of the other micros had too. One of the things which do appear obvious is the sprite sizes. Sprites themselves are fairly decent looking. They are on the larger side, and when many of these swarm at you, these can be a little tricky to avoid without being hit. Something a little off-putting further is when dying in this version, for a few seconds the ratio of the screen can change, and that's a little bit off-putting. Like I say, it really isn't perfect by far. If you really want a decent Gemini Wing style game for the C64, then check out Sarah Jane Avery's Zeta Wing 1 and 2. Totally inspired by Gemini Wing, but miles superior to this. The Atari ST got a really great version of Gemini Wing. Sure, the music is very much speeded up compared to the slower paced arcade game music, but it's really nicely composed with that 8-bit sound which this famous Atari ST computer was known for. The colours and contrast in this version are much better than the Amiga's conversion, a really nice effort with the Atari ST's colour palette that is. The sprites themselves look so much nicer than the next version's offering too. Hit collision detection is fairly spot on here, but we do have a bizarreness of stages being relatively short compared to the arcades game. And of course for a 16-bit computer, you might think there was a bit more effort put into this. We don't exactly get that narrow vertical arcade presentation here, but for what it is, this is a good enough to play game even if enemy sprites do whiz down at you like a bat from hell. Gumballs are nicely detailed here too when enemies are carrying them around on the screen. The real issue with this version is its drops in frame rates. This can easily be noticed with the first boss. Besides that, I am pretty sure that most Atari ST users back in 1989 would have been fairly chuffed to play this release. Now, although the colours and sprites aren't as detailed as the Atari ST's offering, a Gemini Wing, this Commodore Amiga version just runs a hell of a lot smoother. This is very noticeable with boss fights. For example here, the projectiles being fired at us from the first boss are much smoother, whereas the Atari ST version slowed down significantly here. The game also controlled more smoothly. I didn't really notice any slowdowns, or at least significant slowdowns here. The music is also matched with the slower paced style which the arcade game originally contained. I think there is a fine line between both the ST version and this version. You either had the nicer looking visuals with the Atari ST's version, which of course slowed the game down, or you had a faster moving game with a lot less frame rate issues with this release. Something that both this and the ST had, which looked awesome, was when firing, the colours used look incredible. Is this one of the better Commodore Amiga scrolling shooters? Well, it's not bad. I would like to just call it a slightly below average shoot 'em up for the Amiga, but in the context of this video, it's likely one of the better home conversions. If you were lucky enough to own a Sharp X68000 back in the day, you would have had the best home conversion a mile off of Gemini Wing. This one released just a year after the Virgin Masteronic releases for the west of the world. System Seicon released this one, and it's pretty much like playing the arcade game. I have had people argue in past videos where Sharp X68000 has been concerned, where people said it's an unfair ranking. Now, let's be honest, many Capcom CPS-1 arcade games were developed by using an X68000, but some weren't. Regardless, it's of the same era of computing, and Japan just happened to have an extremely amazing computer. Even more amazing if you could afford one of these at the time. What makes this version so great is that not only does it run just like the arcade game itself, but we also get a choice of screen layouts when booting the game. If we boot as normal, we get a more or less full screen when playing Gemini Wing, but the true arcade experience is by choosing its vertical mode. This is where it feels like you're truly playing the arcade version of this game. We also get a configuration menu where we can change low to high resolutions, and that's it for ranking every version of Gemini Wing. So which version did you have? Did you happen to be an MSX user and was very much disappointed that even the Spectrum version was better in that release? Or did you have a X68000? Was you truly that lucky enough to have one of these miracle machines? Anyways, as always, drop a comment in the comment section and let us know your memories of this game. And anyways, until next time, thanks for watching.